So I had a problem most of you are likely familiar with. My clamps were everywhere around the shop. They were leaning against the wall in the corner or clamped to any random surface, so they're just kind of out of the way. But what I really needed is something to put my clamps, a dedicated spot to put them neatly away. I'm Fabi from Bau-Woodworks, and now I'm going to show you how to build that sucker. I wanted to build a clamp rack that saves space, is close to my bench and can hold a variety of clamps. Since getting a sheet of plywood into my basement is quite a hassle, I started to break it down in our driveway. To lift the plywood off the ground, I laid out rigid foam insulation sheets. For the whole project, I used 18mm birch plywood. With my cordless plunge saw, a guide rail and this right angle guide rail square, I established a clean and square edge on one side. I measured from there and cut the panel for the back of the rack to size. For the other pieces, I only cut the sheet roughly to size to get it into my basement easily. Therefore, I had to rip the second sheet. My tracks are too short for that, but with this little connector, I was able to join two tracks together. To get this shot, I had to climb on the roof of our garage, and my neighbors seemed to really wonder what I was doing on the roof with a tripod and a camera. However, down in my shop I formatted all remaining pieces on the table saw. If you want to build a clamp rack yourself, check out the link in the description, as I have a full set of plans available for this project. For free. You simply sign up to my newsletter and get the plans straight to your inbox. They include all measurements and a cutting diagram to efficiently make use of your plywood sheets. You can easily reposition the individual holders to tweak the design to your specific needs. After all parts were cut, I also made a series of spacers in a variety of sizes. They helped me to align all the parts, as you'll see in a minute. At the top left of the rack, I wanted to have a shelf to put some accessories. Below the shelf there are 5 holders for parallel jaw clamps, and each holder is able to hold up to 4 clamps. For the joinery, I decided to go with dominoes, which are floating tenons. Therefore, I had to mark where to register the domino. Marking the top of the shelf was easy. The dominoes I used were 8x40mm, and hence routing 20mm in each part would end up with proud dominoes on the parts where the slots are routed into the face side, since my plywood is only 18mm thick. To accommodate for that, I routed 25mm into the edges and only 15mm into the face sides. I set the fence of the domino closest to 18mm, which was 16mm. Attached the vacuum and plugged it in. Routing the recess was pretty foolproof at this point, since I only had to align it to my marks. Before routing into the face sides, I switched the depth setting to 15mm. What I really like about this joinery method is the fact that dry fitting is pretty comfortable and I can temporarily assemble the piece. Granted, getting the dominoes out can be a challenge sometimes, but with a set of pliers they all come out, eventually. To position the shelf, I used a pair of spacers and put the shelf board on top of it. I stroke a line where the base of the domino will be registered against, and some tick marks with the head of my combo square. I registered the domino against my line and routed the slot. After switching to 25mm and flipping the fence over, I made the counterparts. No surprise, as they fitted perfectly. To really hold everything in place, I used a parallel jaw clamp. I positioned the shelf unit flush against the top and side, made my marks, and routed the slots to attach it to the back of the rack. I stroke another line that indicates the bottom of the holders for the clamps. With the help of the spacers, I could temporarily put the holders into place and mark them as well as the back for the dominoes. I did this with all the holders. Then it was just a matter of batching out the domino slots in the back panel as well as the holders themselves. Light speed! On the right side of the rack, I positioned another 2 holders for my pipe clamps. In the center, I wanted to have a bunch of different holders for all my special clamps, like one-handed clamps and band strap clamps. I marked a couple of slots on a cutoff piece and turned to the table saw. Where I set up the jig, I used to make dovetails on the table saw. If you haven't seen that video, you might want to check it out. It's a pretty cool way to batch cut dovetails. Anyways, I lined up my marks with the blade, set the stop in place and made my cut. To widen the slots, I put a wood strip as a spacer between my workpiece and the stop. That strip is exactly as thick as my saw blade. To the side of the holder, I attach small squares that make it more rigid. I used the same techniques as before to attach the holders to the back panel. For the band strap clamps, the holder was fairly easy. Just 2 cutoff strips glued together at 90 degrees, which function as a hook for up to 4 clamps. I know, this step is absolutely not necessary, but I wanted to position the holder precisely square to the edge of the back panel. With a large square, I drew a line square to the edge and in the center of the holder's new spot. With a triangular ruler, you probably remember from math class, I could mark the outside edges of the holder. Then it was just a matter of following the same process as for all the other holders. To give the holders for the parallel jaw clamps a bit of a nicer look, I decided to cut off the bottom corner at 45 degrees. Since I like to mess things up, I marked every single piece. Over at the table saw, I set my miter gauge to 45 degrees and cut 2 pieces at a time. Parallel jaw clamps are pretty heavy, as you might know. I'm not very keen on having them rain down on me because I bumped into them. A small hook on the holder should do the trick. I made a rough, very rough sketch on how they should be. I positioned my fence of the bandsaw according to my mark and clamped an offcut as the depth stop to the table. That gave me the first part of the hook. I removed the provisional depth stop and made the second cut. For this project, I opted to put finish on the parts before the glue up. So many inside corners make it really hard to get finish in there. I sanded with 220 grit to get rid of my pencil marks and have a smoother surface. I made sure not to sand through the layer of ply. Been there, done that, not cool. With the router, I gave all edges a small chamfer. For the finish, I went with Osmo's top oil. You might know it as Polyax, depending on where you're located. When applying it with a hand pad, I avoided the areas that became glue surfaces later on, since the glue wouldn't stick as well. I applied just 1 coat, since this is a sharp project. While I take my time here to finish all the holders, make sure you're subscribed to my channel and turn on the notifications by hitting the bell icon. I have a bunch of cool projects lined up for the shop as well as furniture pieces. After letting the finish dry overnight, it was time for the glue up. I know, it's paradox, but I pre-drilled holes for the screws that act as clamps, so I won't have to clamp the parts of my clamp rack. It would have been a pain to get clamps on for all the holders. Glue in the domino slots, insert the dominoes, glue on the holder, spread it a bit, and then put the holder in place. Through the holes I drilled earlier, I pre-drilled the holders as well. Notice the stupid look you have to put on when eyeballing the angle. Super important. I drove in 2 screws per holder. The young lady from quality management came over once again to check on me. She showed me the right way to use an impact driver and left quickly afterwards, since she apparently had other more important stuff to do than to teach me some basics. With the rack on my workbench again, I glued the remaining holders to the back. Whoops! When gluing the shelf to the back, it was at this point I realized I forgot to put glue on. So I put glue on and gave it another run. Somehow I struggled a lot to get that thing together. But a few taps with the mallet and a hammer made me a happy woodworker. Again, I used screws from the back. I removed the squeeze out with a paper towel, not too carefully since it is shop furniture. To hang the rack to the wall, I used a French cleat at the top, 2 strips of ply cut in a 45-degree angle that interlock. I pre-drilled and countersunk one of the strips to accept the screws that hold it to the wall. I positioned it on the wall, making sure it is level, and marked the screw hole locations with a pencil. Hammer drill time! After the holes were drilled, I inserted wall anchors and screwed the strip to the wall. I glued the other French cleat strip to the back of the rack, held it in place temporarily with a clamp, and again secured it with screws. At the bottom of the rack, I attached a regular strip of ply to the back to accommodate for the distance to the wall the French cleat creates. After lifting the rack on the wall, I drilled through the back panel and the wood strip to get marks on the wall for the wall anchors. You might have wondered how I got the rack on the wall. Well, that's how. Let me first tell you that sucker is heavy. I leaned it on one corner in order for the other corner to get on my bench. Then I pushed it on my bench. Went around the bench hoping it doesn't fall over. With one foot on the bench and my elbow on my thigh, I could use my leg to lift most of the weight. Last step of attaching it to the wall was to drive the screws through the bottom strip. Finally, it was time for the best part of the build, putting all the clamps in their new place. Parallel jaw clamps, more parallel jaw clamps, and one more parallel jaw clamp. One-handed clamps, the band strap clamps, and the pipe clamps. And the accessories for the parallel jaw clamps. I'm super happy how this project turned out. All my clamps are neatly stored here. I can use them here on my bench and then put them away if I don't need them anymore. They're not falling down on me even if I bump into them. If you want to build a clamp rack yourself, make sure you check out the free plans on my website. Just sign up for my email newsletter there and you will get the link to the plans. If you haven't yet, make sure you're subscribed to my channel. I have tons of cool project planned, furniture project as well as shop project. So, see you in the next video. Whoops.